welcome TJ Woodward. How are you doing?
I am well, Paul. I'm so happy to be here with you. Looking forward to our conversation wherever it may take us.
Well, I mean, you wrote such an incredible book. And when I read it, I thought, I'm just going to reach out and just see if you respond. And you were like, yes. And I was like, right, okay, got you.
Absolutely. I tend to be a yes almost always.
uh, I'm glad. I'm glad. So if I need to come back, that's what's going to happen. But I wanted to jump straight in
Perfect.
with a question of you talk about something directly at the beginning of the book, and I loved it. And I wanted just to ask you about that for the audience. And it's you say you cannot be your authentic self without becoming intimate with your true nature. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, we come into this world as whole and perfect beings, and that place within us, that spiritual essence, there's so many different names for it. Some might call it our God self, our Buddha nature, our true nature. That's ultimately the truth of who and what we are. And each of us is capable of experiencing that at any given moment. Becoming intimate with that means cultivating a relationship with that. And for many of us, I would dare to say probably most of us, we separate or we believe we separate from that essential self throughout life's experiences. And then we come into maybe recovery, maybe therapy, maybe a spiritual community. And it really is, how do we get somewhere? But the truth is, how do we actually return and become intimate with our true nature, our very beingness? That's true authenticity, because a lot of times we hear about authenticity and we think, oh, it's telling the truth. But we're talking about something much deeper here.
I love that. And what do you think is preventing people from discovering their true nature? Is this a rite of passage? Is this a journey that we're all on anyway, and we have to overcome these hurdles? What is this all about?
You know, it's interesting. Carl Jung says we spend the first 40 years developing a healthy ego and the second 40 years dismantling it. And that has seemed to be true for me. I had a pretty profound awakening experience around the age 40 where I realized this idea of like achieving and attaining and becoming something really wasn't serving me. And then it became this journey back to self, back to this true self. And I think what prevents people from experiencing it is, one, the idea that we can't. I've heard spiritual teachers say, well, we're not ever going to be fully enlightened. And I want to say, actually, that's definitely not true. We're all fully enlightened. It might just be that we haven't remembered that. So that's the first thing. And then second to that, I think it's quite simple, actually. It's really the programming that we've received from the world that teaches us that we're limited or damaged or broken in some way. And so for most of us, the journey of enlightenment, which happens in an instant, is really one of unlearning all these ideas, beliefs, and quite frankly, the frequency that's attached to those that is keeping us stuck and small and limited.
I love that answer. And when you mentioned your awakening. Had you been working towards that? Had you been doing the work, or did it just happen out of nowhere? What happened for you?
A little bit of both,
Yeah.
honestly. I had been doing a lot of work. I had a sort of this awakening experience that came in the form of realizing there had to be something more to life. And at the time, I had a successful business, but I was also very deeply in debt. So it was this very interesting thing. And I was also struggling, I think, in many ways to ask the question, who am I? And I had this calling, if you will, or this message that I wanted to become a spiritual teacher of some sort. And that honestly had been my desire all my life. But I finally had the courage to say yes to that. And at that point, my world started to crumble and collapse. And I lost pretty much everything I owned and went into this place of a deep quest, if you will, to really know myself. And then all of that sort of set the stage for at least one moment I can think of that was really profound, where I had this awakening experience. And all I mean by an awakening experience is I really was able to experience reality, that we're all love, that we're all whole, that we're all perfect, and the world is also that. And it was a profound experience of that, which was way more than a mental construct, which I think is really what it had been previous to that.
And did you, after you had your awakening experience, did you have any doubts? Because sometimes with some people with awakening, you get the ego trying to reconstruct itself and go back to what we called a dream state. And, I remember that happening for me, and there's still fluctuations with that. What happened for you?
Well, I love your question because I think it's so important that we talk about this, because I do sometimes think people believe that we're going to have this awakening experience, and then from then on our ego will no longer be at play, if you will. And for me, that was not at all my story. What happened, and I was in Varanasi, India, I had this profound experience of oneness, this profound experience of love. And it wasn't my first experience. I had had some similar experiences in my 20s, but something about this one was such a different quality. And of course, I wanted to stay there forever. My ego did come back. My ego did then try to interpret what had happened. One way to say it is we have these profound experiences of reality, and then we can spend the rest of our life trying to figure out what happened. And it really isn't about figuring it out. One of the things that I think is important to say is, I don't think the goal is to be rid of the ego. A lot of times we say it is, or we hear it is, or we must move beyond the ego. I think that the subtle shift that happened for me, and I didn't know it had happened until years later, honestly. Of course, I wanted the ego to be removed. I wanted to only know love. And then my ego came back in and tried to interpret, and then tried to not only figure it out, but also just came back in and tried to be in charge again. And what I discovered, actually looking back on it, is that I did have a profound shift in my relationship to my ego. The ego is an important thing. It's the personality. It's what drives us in many ways. Perhaps once the ego is removed, we're no longer here in our bodies, right? But what happened is I realized through a series of events that really followed that spiritual experience that the ego was a useful tool, but it's when it's in charge that it starts to cause issues. And so that was a subtle and yet very powerful shift for me.
Wow. And how did that? I mean, it is a big experience, and I can relate to that. And my ego was casting the doubt of, you know, did this really happen? You're not really awake or anything like that. It's you're deluded. It tried to create control everything about it, and that was an interesting experience. Um, did your experience have an impact on the people around you, and how they saw you, how they were experiencing, TJ?
I think the short answer is yes, for sure. I mean, it was at that time that I was really coming into my own as a spiritual teacher. It was at that time, soon after that, that I started my first spiritual community. I started bringing my spiritual teachings, if you will, to the addiction treatment world. So I think it did have a profound effect on the people around me. One of the things that's interesting, though, is, we have these contracts, if you will, that are unconscious with people. And so sometimes when we have a quantum leap or a profound shift, maybe the people around us aren't quite ready to see us differently. But for me, when it was such an authentic and powerful experience, I was no longer in this. It didn't matter to me. And that sounds maybe a little bit uncaring, but I discovered that it literally didn't matter to me what people thought of me. And I'd been saying that for years, like, what other people think of me is not my business. We hear that, but I really understood it at a very deep level. And I also understood that it was really all projection. So I was beginning to understand at a deeper level that it really wasn't what people were thinking about me. It's what I thought they were thinking about me that was a window into my own self-awareness and my own self-image. Then the whole game changed, and it did feel like a game, if you will, because I started asking questions like, if I know there's only love, what does this mean in this situation, in this relationship, in this friendship, and how I perceive what they just said to me? And everything shifted in a really beautiful way at that point.
That's a very powerful question. Has someone inspired you with that, or is that something that's an insight that you received yourself? Where did that come from?
I would say that it's a little bit of both, right? I think a lot of times we have these spiritual truths that we can come to either in meditation or a spontaneous insight, and then find that someone else has said something really similar. And I love that. I think there's a big difference between an intellectual understanding. So it could be said that I've heard that I had been hearing similar questions for decades, but then
Yeah.
I understood it at a deeper level. And then sometimes it also comes from this deep insight where I say, wow, that's a very interesting question. I wonder where that came from.
Yeah, and it has there been a big change in your spiritual beliefs since awakening? You know, it's interesting. We can have all of these belief systems that we're like, yes, this is how I think the universe works, or I think spirituality works. And then with awakening, there's a little bit of a, oh, um, what did, did it change your spiritual beliefs? How did it impact you?
Well, honestly, Paul, if the true answer is it made me realize that there is very little I know. Right. And that I used to hear people say the more awake I am, the less I know. And I
Yeah.
thought, oh, they're being so humble. But now I'm no, because a lot of times when we talk about spirituality, we talk about belief, but
Mm.
belief is in the mind. An experience of oneness, an experience that there's only love calls everything I ever believed into question. I think about this meme that was really, really funny to me. It was at a new thought or a new age fair, and there was past life regressions at a booth, and the line was really long. And then someone said, I read your future, and the line was really long. And the person in the middle said present moment awareness, and no one was in that line. And I love that because all these things that I thought mattered, what
Yeah.
happens after we die, none of that mattered because I realized that there's something so much greater happening here that's way beyond thought.
I think that's really beautiful. I love that. I love that experience. And I think one of the scariest things about awakening is the idea that you're going to discover that your beliefs are simply just that,
Mm.
beliefs. And it's very humbling. It's a very humbling experience. Like you said, when I had my experience, I realized I knew nothing. It's like everything that I thought, because I've been Christian, I've been spiritual, then I went atheist, then spiritual again.
Yeah.
I've dipped in that, all truth seeking. And then suddenly it was like, actually, I know absolutely nothing. And I think that can be very scary for someone who may be embedded within any type of religion.
Yeah, and we're taught from a very early age that thought matters, opinions matter, points
Mm.
of view matter. And that's something that gets deeply programmed. Most of our education system is based on finding the answer. Some even believe that's what science is doing, finding the answer. But true science is actually being in the question. I wonder if it's this, let's explore. And in that way, we could say that that's also spirituality. Let me see what this is. Let me explore. And I agree with you wholeheartedly. I realized how attached I was to so many of my points of view when I had this awakening experience. And, it's not necessarily required that we have this one experience where we touch reality. For some people, it's more of an educational variety, if you will, or more of a gradual awakening. But when I realized, as you said so beautifully, I know nothing. It's not about thought. Thought is what is creating separation. I took a spiritual challenge with a friend of mine to not have an opinion for 30 days. And I'll tell you, if you want to go on a quest to realize the mind, it's kind
Yeah.
of like those silent retreats, right? I
Yeah.
go to
Yeah.
a silent retreat and I realize I'm not saying anything, but my mind is so active with judgment. This is good. This is bad. This is right. And so these experiences of oneness made me understand at a cellular level, oh, this is reality. And any of us have it available to us at any moment. It's not necessarily some journey or some destination. It really is what's happening right in this moment.
Yeah, I think it was Sam Harris who talked about it on the Waking Up app, or someone mentioned it, that there's only one fact that they know, and that is that we're a consciousness having this experience. The rest of it
That's right.
is a belief system, and it stands
That's
true.
right.
I do know. I understood the logic of it when I heard it, and then when I had the awakening experience, I'm like, oh, now I know what that
Right.
really means. It's a very different thing, isn't it?
It really is. And then at that point, life becomes a very different, I have a very different relationship with life, right? Because I know a lot of people, I think, relate to this. And for me, my entire 20s was, there's something wrong with the world and I need to be part of changing it. Let me change the world, change the world. The world is broken. And I realized, both in gradually in spiritual practice and then with this, a few of these awakening experiences, that that's not really the reality here. That's not ultimate reality. That's all living in relative reality. And so when I'm awake to my true nature or have an intimate relationship, then the paradox is then I actually do make a difference in the world. When I'm not trying to change it or I'm not viewing it as broken, then I can truly be of service. My friend Michael Beckwith says, we're not here to save the world. We're here to serve the new paradigm. The new paradigm is this awakening that we're talking about, this knowing, this intimate relationship with who we really are.
And I love that. And do you think it comes back to, we have this, I'm a coach and people often say to me, what's my purpose? How do I find my purpose? And again, it's looking for that vocation. It's looking for that one thing where they can leave a legacy, where they feel like they're making a difference. But there is an ultimate purpose. And, which is, I think, is to realize the truth about yourself, to remember who you really are. Did that change? Does that sound familiar to you? Did that change your direction at all with your spiritual work? I know that you wanted to be a spiritual teacher. That's happened. But when you began to realize the truth about your purpose, did that change anything for you?
It changed everything, right? Because I thought my purpose was a role that I play. And instead, the purpose is simply to awaken. And we keep using that term. And so awaken is simply to know who we really are beyond this idea of good, bad, right, wrong. Rumi said it many, many years ago. There is a field beyond the idea of right and wrong. I will meet you there, right? And that field is a field of consciousness. And so when I understand my purpose is to bring that into the world, then the role that I'm playing becomes less significant. Now, there is, I think, something that is like paradoxical, maybe you would say, or maybe even, oh, wow, I get to hold these two truths at the same time. Because then one could say, well, if your purpose is to simply be awake, then you don't need to do anything. And that might be true, but that hasn't been my experience thus far. My experience has been, oh, I have this message that now I just want to share with everyone. And I want to share that in a way that it can benefit other people's lives. I mean, I think about my own life literally being saved when I was suicidal in my early 20s. And the person who did that had this message of awakening and helped take me on a journey toward my own wholeness. There's nothing more profound than being a conduit for that on planet Earth. I think that the easiest way for me to frame it in my mind is, after awakening, it's like, in a way, what we do matters very little, but who we be, if you will, or how we're being is what truly matters. But the greatest paradox, and I talk about this a lot in Conscious Creation, my third book, is once I'm awake to that, then all of a sudden, the everything that I'd been striving so desperately to manifest became easy. It was starting to open up in a much different way because I was living on purpose, not trying to find my purpose. And those two things are very, very different.
And I love that. And talking about your book, Conscious Creation, what is conscious creation?
Well, conscious creation came out of my many years of being in New Thought, many years of being in recovery, and just kind of observing what people are talking about when they say they want to manifest their best life. We think about the law of attraction, which, became very, very popular when the movie The Secret came out, and it became, how can I manifest my very best life? And, as someone who's coached people, who's worked with people individually and in groups, I hear the common theme of, once I get this thing, I will be happy. Once I get this partner, I will be happy. Once I manifest the house, I will be happy. Once I get this perfect career in alignment, I will be happy. And they often want to start with goal setting. What is my intention? We think about thoughts held in mind. We attract through our vibration. And all of that is true on one level. And conscious recovery is saying there's something much deeper here. And so I've created this 5-step process. And the first 2 steps aren't about goals or intentions or manifestation. It's about what needs to be addressed making peace with the past and overcoming core false beliefs. What are these ideas I've gathered up about myself? How can I begin to live beyond those, to dismantle those, to question those, so that I can start to experience my true nature? And then from there, asking that self, that higher self or that true nature, what's the highest possibility for my life? And that then becomes a very different paradigm than how can I manifest the perfect partner so I can be happy? That's based in an idea of lack. And once I get this, I'll be okay. And I did that for well over a decade. And this process that I've created is something much different.
Is that the main? Do you think that's the problem with the Secret, Rhonda Byrne's book? Is that because it just focuses on the material side of things and how the idea that you'll get what you want just by thinking what you want. And for a lot of people that didn't quite work. What do you think was going on? What's the problem with it, and what do you think is going wrong with people that are struggling to manifest what they want into their lives?
Yeah, well, I will say I think it's absolutely perfect because it's a stage of development.
Yeah.
We wouldn't want to say being a 5-year-old is any less significant than being an 80-year-old. We're just in different life experiences, right? And so the secret to me is a really beautiful bridge out of being a victim to the world. My thoughts do create reality. So in conscious creation, I talk about these different levels of consciousness, and that it was a beautiful and is a beautiful bridge for people to move out of the world as happening to me. So I actually have agency. I can actually manifest. I can create. What happens with it, I think, is twofold to answer your question. One, what happened to me or for me is I did manifest everything I put on the vision board. And then I had that, like, is this all there is? Like,
Yeah.
I got the house, I got the car, I got the partner, I got the things that I thought would make me happy. And it's not that they made me unhappy. It's just that it didn't really change anything. That's one thing. But the second piece is, a lot of times people will interpret the law of attraction or, the secret through this egoic lens of like, I need to manifest in order to be free. And that can be our thoughts. And if we haven't done, and why I created these first 2 steps in conscious creation is if I don't do what I call the clearing steps, then I'm just going to be constantly trying to create out of my mind. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's a beautiful part of the process, but there's going to be a point where we say there has to be more to this. So maybe a person has tried and it doesn't seem to work for them. So for me, I would invite people to look at these steps of making peace with the past and overcoming some of these beliefs and ideas, and quite frankly, the frequency that we have that's attached to them.
How does someone listening to this thinking that sounds amazing? Actually, yes, it's a good idea that I do clear my past. I might make peace with it. What would help there? What would be a great step to take?
Well, I think when it comes to making peace with the past, I originally used the term forgiveness. And then I also realized, it's an acronym movie, my 5 steps, and FUVI just isn't a great acronym. So that was one thing. But then I also realized that forgiveness was one of those loaded words. And
Yeah.
it was deeply entrenched with this idea that someone has done something that's so wrong and that I must learn how to forgive them, or I've done something that I know I can never be forgiven for. And I've seen people getting stuck there. I've seen people still blaming the person that harmed them when they were young, and they're not even alive anymore. And so we want to look at how we can empower ourselves to shift out of the paradigm of forgiveness and into, regardless of what has happened, moving beyond the idea of right and wrong and good and bad. What would it take to be free? What would it be like to be free? And can I make peace with this regardless? And then I discovered something that, I guess is somewhat provocative and maybe even controversial in some circles. We really can change the past because the past is alive in our minds. The only past that actually exists is my story about the past. Now, we want to be careful. We're not saying to someone it didn't happen. What happens is an event happens, we make big decisions or we absorb things about the experience, and then that becomes deeply entrenched or concretized in our memory. And then the past is constantly informing our present. And so as we go back and heal that, We can make different conclusions. We can decide not to absorb it. And in that way, we quite frankly change the past. And if that doesn't work for people, we absolutely can change our relationship with what happened.
I love that. I think one of the biggest secrets to life is the narrative we have about ourselves and our past and our future. And we have the ability to change that narrative. And it doesn't stop the fact that we experience something very dark and we could have been a victim to it at that time. But we don't have to carry it around with us to continue being a victim to it. And by repeating that story, we have the ability to change that story.
Yeah, and I think it's really important what you're saying, because again, we're not saying like, I work with a lot of people who, for example, experienced sexual trauma when they were a child. We would never want to say, oh, that only lives in your mind. Let's have a new narrative, right? And you and I are saying something much deeper, and that is that event happened and you absorbed and decided, and it created a narrative and it created a frequency. And then you're walking around vibrating with the belief that you're broken, and you keep re-experiencing it. That's what happened in my life. I believed I was unlovable, so I kept unconsciously choosing relationships over and over and over again to confirm that. As much as I wanted to someone to love me, I literally would repel it. So that's the point of empowerment. We want to move out of I'm a victim to that and into this happened. I'm going to move beyond the idea of good, bad, right, and wrong, and I'm going to be more curious about what I decided and what I absorbed. And in that way, the healing work is going back and allowing the 8-year-old to heal, the 7-year-old to heal, the 6-year-old to heal, because it's not just a cognitive process. And I think this is where we can all get tripped up. I become aware of my narrative, and then I think, oh, I should change it. Well, true. But how does one actually change the narrative? We can rewire the brain to have a new thought, but the deeper work, and I think the shortcut, if you will, is to go back and do the deeper healing where we first originated these core false beliefs, have a different conclusion about it, and then we literally start to change the trajectory of our life from the past to the present. And as you said, as long as I'm carrying around these stories of lack or limitation or brokenness, I will continually replicate those unconsciously.
Yeah, I love that. And I just want to add that when you change the feelings associated with the original story, the original experience, that in itself helps transform the narrative. So there is, I didn't mention that earlier, but it's like a cycle, isn't it? It's just an ever evolving process that the story becomes something else.
Yeah. And then the frequency affects the narrative. And then, because I think a lot of times we think change the narrative. And I would say that maybe a good starting point would be to question the narrative.
Yeah.
So where did I get this thought? How do I feel when I believe it? How does this affect my relationships? What do I experience the world? What if there's a different story I could adopt? All these questions allow us to start to open up and start to change our relationship with the narrative. Because for me, I was quite brutal with myself. I wasn't aware of it, but I would say things like, oh, I shouldn't think that. Stop thinking that. Right. So it was almost like I was adding to the frequency by trying to change the narrative. And as I started to question it, I started to realize, oh, my narrative isn't solid. It's not who I am.
Yeah.
It's not. It's just this idea I've been carrying around.
Yeah, it is interesting, isn't it? I think it was a therapist I'd had a while ago who reminded me that because I was bullied and I had a very similar program of I'm unlovable, I'm unlikable, and I carried that around and also attracted some very interesting relationships from that sort of frequency. But what that was pointed out was that the way that I was thinking wasn't mine; it was given to me. It was,
That's right.
Almost like projected. You're unlovable. You're unlikable, and this is why this is how we're gonna treat you. So I just absorbed it, soaked it up, and that was it. That's what I believed, and it was just questioning who gave me this belief. It's not mine.
Yeah.
Who gave me this belief?
Exactly.
And where's it come from? And the line of questioning you said, and then therefore it begins to the belief becomes very, very shaky. And if honesty is a value, then it's hard to hold on to this as it can't be true the way that I've been believing it all this time. And that is powerful.
Yeah. Yeah, because then I realized that it's just one thought amongst tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of possible thoughts. And it's just as easy for me to say, I wonder if that is, as you said, where did this originate is one of the questions I will ask someone. Where did that idea or belief originate? Because then we're going to look at like when we're a little child, because most of these traumatic experiences that where we really absorb these that land are really early in childhood and our brains aren't even developed. So it wasn't like my 5-year-old said, oh, I must not be good enough. It was more like a frequency of shame, a belief in brokenness. I absorbed that. And you're using the term, and I love that because then we can send it back. And I don't mean send it back to the person who gave it to us because they were unconscious too. It's like, no, this is not who I am. And then it goes back to the starting point of a relationship with the essential self as a starting point. Then we can start to question everything we've ever believed, every BS belief system that we've adopted. And then we start to live in this new and really miraculous way. And suddenly we're like, oh my gosh, I've been such a powerful creator of my universe based on these old ideas. What might happen if I were to have a new set of ideas and beliefs and a frequency? Because ultimately life's an experiment.
Yeah, absolutely. Every person listening to this is a manifesting powerhouse. And I'm just going to point out that you've manifested listening to this conversation. It's there in your awareness right now. And so I wonder what you'll get from that. And I think that's important to just point out because people often forget to have this weird amnesia, how powerful they actually are. And yet look at what they've created in the only moment that exists in the universe.
That's right. My one of my first teachers said, look at your bank account. If it has constantly or continuously had less than you want it to have, then I want you to say, I am such a powerful manifester. I keep creating this small bank account. Look how powerful I am. And with one small shift, I can change it to a different number. And I love that because money's such a big topic, and it shows up in The Secret, and it shows up because we think if I have more, I'll be happy. But it's a great example of like, oh yeah, I have been consistently manifesting this. And she said, own your power. Say, look how powerful I am that I've been manifesting this. Now what else is possible? If anyone ever wants a question that will shift them instantly, ask the question, what else is possible? And just stay in that question and see what happens.
I love that. I hope people listening are literally asking that question. Keep repeating it, keep repeating it. And 2 points I want to bring up. One is people talk about awakening, and I had a question sent to me by someone who listens to the podcast. And they say, is awakening for the privileged? Is it for people who aren't really suffering? If you have a look at people in Israel, they're talking about the situation in Gaza and, with a sort of famine and suffering around the world. How is this part of the awakening experience? Why is this here? And it was a very good question. And I'd love to ask what your thoughts on, when we talk about awakening, does it seem like it's for the privileged? Are we privileged to be in that position, or is there something else?
Yeah, I mean, like any other question, there are so many different ways to answer it. And I could say yes and no. Absolutely. Yes and no. So what I want to start by saying is if you look at like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? When we're just struggling to know where our next meal is coming from, the conversation of awakening might not be on the table. Because if you know about Maslow, the top is self-actualization or self-realization. That the idea is that as we get our basic needs met, then we start to look at family and friends, then we start to look at community and connection, and that we do evolve into this idea of self-actualization. And that absolutely can be true. And in that way, we would say, yeah, it's for the privileged. We have our life put together in a certain way that we can start to ask these more lofty questions. However, I will also say that in the midst of the greatest trauma, there's a possibility of awakening. As a matter of fact, for many people, and this was true for me, it was in the losing everything. I know that the late, great Wayne Dyer said, spiritual awakening is often preceded by a cataclysmic event like a divorce or a loss of someone, a loss of a loved one, because those moments we question everything. Now, if we're in the midst of a traumatic experience, we might not be thinking, how do I awaken to my best self in the midst of this? It's like we might go into survival, fight, flight, freeze. How do I get through this? And yet, if I think about people who were in the Holocaust, the book Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl, he talks about waking up even in the midst of that any of us would say was a traumatic event. And so it is possible, and perhaps it's a privilege, but the word privilege also gets used in a negative or pejorative way in our culture, and understandably that it does in some ways. And yet this idea of awakening can happen. I mean, if you look at Buddha, the story of Buddha was he, grew up as a prince in the walls of his palace, never saw suffering. It was in going outside of those walls as a young man and seeing suffering that caused him to ask the question, how do we end our suffering? And it wasn't an outside in, it was an inside out. And so then his story of awakening was, in the midst of anything happening in the world, can I have freedom? So it's a very nuanced question, because in one way, absolutely, it's for the privileged that have their basic needs met, and we start to ask these deeper questions. But then on the other hand, it's also the most important when we're in the midst of what anyone would call a traumatic event. And the truth is, planet Earth is filled with that entire spectrum of experience, right? And all of us have traumatic events. And it's possible that those actually can create the awakening or create an opportunity for us to awaken.
Oh, what a fantastic answer. I love that. I do. And I think it makes so much sense. And because one of the things we talk about in spirituality, or the law of attraction, or, we attract our thoughts, we attract what we think, and all of these experiences, people instantly jump to, well, what about people who've got depression, or, as you mentioned earlier, sexual abuse, or something really dark going on? Did they attract it? And these sorts of questions begin to come up. What's your answer in regards to suffering and the idea that we attract what we think, etc.? Because again, I know it's quite nuanced.
Well,
it's quite an important question.
Yeah, no, and I love it. I think it's an important conversation to have, because I was part of a community in the 90s where we wore rubber bands on our wrists. And if we had any negative thought, we flipped it and said, cancel, cancel, universe, don't punish me. Right. And that we didn't say don't punish me, but that was the energy to it. Right. So we thought any thought we had is going to be like Velcro to an experience. And that might be true on some level. But again, there's something so much deeper happening. I think when we get into these conversations of these darker experiences, we never want to blame ourselves, or for that matter, we don't really want to blame others, because blame keeps us stuck in the low frequency. It's understandable, right? I would never want to say to someone who had sexual trauma, you created that, or what did you do to create that? We call it metaphysical malpractice. What did I do to create this cancer? What did I do to create this experience? That's keeping us stuck. Instead, what we want to say is like, okay, this is happening. How do I heal from that? Because we want to, even in an experience like sexual trauma, when we're saying that was horrible that happened and we stay there, we're going to continue to have the experience of that. We're going to look at what we absorbed because of that. And again, understandably, we're not saying, oh, you must have had negative thinking that attracted that. Like that's just straight up bullying and abusive. And I think sometimes when it comes to spirituality, there is a little flavor of that. Instead, we want to say, okay, regardless of what created this, how can I now own my power to start to uncreate this or to heal from this? And again, when we're stuck in the that shouldn't have happened, I think if I'm going to ever say anything in the simplest way, the definition of suffering is this shouldn't be happening. That shouldn't have happened. Right? Because that is suffering. And again, Buddha says there's a difference between pain and suffering. So far, the experience of pain is something that's been part of the human experience, but suffering is this idea. It's a frequency. The suffering is different. I learned that going to India and watching the Western view. I remember I was on this like tour bus in India once with a group of people, all Westerners, and they were looking into this, what we would call a poor village. And people on the bus were just like, oh, that's so horrible that they're living that way. And I got off the bus and walked around. I saw so much joy. The message isn't poverty equals joy. The message is we can be free regardless. And the people on the bus, the judgment, they weren't free in the midst of that. And I know that was a very layered answer, but I think sometimes these things need to be addressed in a more nuanced way.
Yeah, it's such a nuanced subject. It's such a nuanced subject, and people often ask me, "Why is there suffering in the world?" And I say, I don't know the answer. Yeah, that's the reality. All I know is that the universe is having this experience, and anything that I say is going to be a belief. All I know is that we're all part of the same thing, and that is as far as I can go, which doesn't satisfy the ego
Right.
because it wants a story, it wants to control it, it wants to have a narrative to hold on to have comfort from. And I
That's
just don't
right.
know.
We want to make sense of it all. The ego does.
Yeah, I just don't know. Going to jump to something that you talked about in your book was the law of radiance, because I think this is powerful, and I really would like this to be brought into the conversation, because I think the law of attraction is one thing, but moving to the law of radiance is definitely another. Can you explain what the law of radiance
Yes.
is?
Absolutely. And I want to share with anyone watching, my friend Michael Beckwith also talks about the law of radiance. And it's very interesting because he and I, on several different occasions, have come to something that is similar. And I love that, right? We pick it up in collective consciousness in some way. And so it's actually quite simple. The law of attraction is often, and I know this isn't the whole story, but often interpreted as I want to raise my vibration so I can attract the good into my life or attract the experiences that I want into my life. The law of radiance is saying at the core of who you are is such a bright light that we're going to start radiating that out into the world rather than trying to attract anything. That's a profound shift in our way of being. I don't need to attract anything in order to be happy or to be free. Instead, as we've been talking about, I begin to dismantle and unlearn or move beyond or question the frequency, the idea, everything that I absorbed, spending time in the silence, reconnecting or becoming aware of my connection or my oneness with source, and then from there radiating that into the world. And some might say, well, it sounds a little bit like semantics, because ultimately when you're radiating that into the world, you're going to experience more of it. Yes. And it's a profoundly different way of being, because we're not trying to attract anything. We're really wanting to radiate love into the world. And that's where things start to become really interesting.
I think that's absolutely beautiful. It is interesting, isn't it, that with awakening, it was in one thing I did notice was there was less focus on what I wanted in the future. It was
Because
I'm
there
just
is
going to,
no future.
yeah, it's just now, and it was just this. I'm just going to see what happens. I'm just going to see what happens, and it's been an interesting ride ever since.
It sure has, hasn't it? Isn't it? It's fascinating,
Yeah.
because then we do, as I've said a couple of times, live in this seemingly paradoxical universe. Like I require nothing from the world, and yet I have this desire to radiate this love into the world. And there is a sense of like radiating love into the world is going to make a difference. But somehow that's different than what can the world bring me so that I can be happy, or what can the world bring me, right? What can I attract? So it really is just flipping it in a different way. And then we live in curiosity. And I think living in curiosity is just a really different way of being in the world.
I think, yeah, absolutely. It's a wonderful state of mind to actually begin to have that open mind, and being aware of what you sort of draw to you to, again, begin to explore who you are, what it is that you truly want, and to begin to awaken. And I think that's the ultimate
Yes.
purpose for us all, even though, again, we might get stuck in a mind trap of constantly seeking. Now, that's paradoxical, isn't it? People seek to awaken, but if you carry on seeking, then you can get stuck.
Of course, because in some ways, if we say we're seeking, that also implies that it's not here already. Right.
Yeah.
And yet that's maybe that's the cosmic joke, if you will. We've been seeking this great awakening, then we have the awakening and realize ultimately nothing that we think, I'll put it in the eye, nothing that I thought mattered so much. It really doesn't matter. It changes everything. And yet we're still here in this dimension.
Yeah.
We're here. Maybe we've chosen to be on earth. Maybe we've been assigned to be on earth. Whatever reason we're here to be that love and be that light. And then watch the way life unfolds in a beautiful way. And it's just a very different way of living in the world.
What do you think has been the biggest challenge to you since this happened to you?
Well, I think the biggest challenge has always been living in the idea of duality, right? This idea that I'm not there yet, this idea that I'll never quite awaken, this idea that once I get something, I'll be happy and be free. That's been my life's journey. And that's the ego perspective. And it's always there. I had a client ask me, do you really walk around only experiencing love and joy and connection and oneness? And my answer is yes, I do walk around that way, but I often forget. And the forgetter is the ego coming in and saying, you must achieve, you must become someone, you must do this, you must heal this, all the stuff that the ego says, which is part of our experience, not to be diminished or dismissed or discounted in any way. That's that human part of our experience. But I woke up one day and I thought, we've been saying now that we're spiritual beings having a human experience for hundreds of years, and that was a profound shift. And now is it time for us to say, well, actually, we're spiritual beings having a spiritual experience. And in that way, all of it is spiritual. The illness, the divorce, the trauma, the addiction, the love, the connection, the birth of a new being, all of that is part of that. It's all spiritual. Then I'm no longer rejecting this as something I want to move from. And then we go back to the very simplest definition that Buddha gave us, that suffering is clinging and aversion. I want more of what feels good and less of what doesn't. Then we become in this place of like, oh, what if it's all spiritual? What if all of this is part of my journey? What if awakening only happens now? These are questions that can help with this.
Yeah, because it does feel like when you're talking about that the world is like a tipping point. That it's and it is. I believe everything is happening as it can. Everything is happening as it only can. Because it would be happening another way if it would. But it's very easy to mind to get caught up in judging and worrying and getting caught up in the them versus us mindset. That's bad. I'm right. They're wrong. I'm right, etc. What would you advise to someone caught up in that sort of mindset, where they're worrying about the world, they're worrying about themselves? What would be a piece of advice that might help them?
Well, a wise person once said there are 3 steps: awareness, awareness, and awareness. So I want to invite people to be aware of what it feels like to have a judgment. Now, this can be a practice that in the beginning, I think can be challenging for people, because people will say, but I am right. You can't say that what's happening in the world is okay. So this is right. And so then I say, well, let's, instead of like, is this right or wrong? We want to say, what gets created when that's my phrase. Instead of like, this is wrong that this is happening. What gets created when I believe it's wrong? What do I feel like in my body? In what way is this useful? In what way is this not useful? Right. And so as we start to question every point of view, we can start to look at like, that has been, what has really caused all harm in the world. Every literal war has been caused by a belief in right and wrong. And so, of course it could be debated. Of course that can be debated if certain things are right and certain things are wrong. The mind really gets hooked with this. Instead, I want to say, I'm aware of how it feels when I have this judgment. Maybe it's not popular to say, but I think we often try to find our tribe, and our tribe is often a tribe of like-minded people. And there was a point in the evolution of the human species where that was literal survival. You had to have a tribe to save yourself from being eaten, to save yourself from the other tribe. And that has become part of our DNA. And we're now discovering, that we can change our relationship with our DNA. This is so powerful. It's what mystics have been saying for so long. Science is saying, oh, through quantum mechanics, through this look at neuroplasticity of the brain, right? I'm going down that road for a specific reason, and that is maybe it's time for us to move beyond the idea of trying to find a group of people who believe everything that we believe. That's that trap, because then what happens if I have a different thought? I might get thrown out of my tribe.
Yeah.
That's a whole other show. Maybe that's a different show that we have.
Well, I think that's when you
question
awaken.
Every thought.
Yeah, when you awaken, it's like, oh no, what if I lose, the people that I have around me? What if I become unrelatable? Those are the worries I had before I'd awakening. It was, when I was researching it, I was just thinking, this all sounds a bit scary, because what if this happens? What if this happens? And I thought, hang on a second, I seem to be frightened of the truth. How does that make sense? That doesn't resonate with me as a job, as a coach.
Right.
We're coming towards the end of our interview, but I wanted to ask you, what 3 books would you recommend to someone who wants to know more, besides your brilliant book, Creating Consciousness, Consciousness Creating? What would you recommend besides your books?
There are so many that are coming to mind. So one of the most influential books for me is A New Earth by Eckhart Tolle. Absolutely love A New Earth. I think that he really articulates the awakening experience in such a profound way in that book. I will refer to Michael Beckwith's book, Life Visioning. I think Michael is one of the profound teachers of our time on planet Earth. And the Life Visioning, his book, is such a part of my book, Conscious Creation, because V is one of the steps in the movie process, and that's visioning. The other book that I love, and the one that's coming to mind, is Byron Katie, Loving What Is. I think her work is incredible. I could keep going on.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just going to stop there because you said 3.
You can give us one more. You can have,
Well, I love Pema Chodron. I think she's a great teacher. For the right person at the right time, her book, When Things Fall Apart, can be so helpful. If someone's going through like some of these conversations we've had where it's a loss, a breakup, When Things Fall Apart by Pema Chodron is just so helpful for so many people.
And are you writing something else? Have you got another project in the pipeline? Because I love your work and would love to see, this is just my ego now, wanting more. Have you got anything else in the pipeline that that you're hoping to release?
It's interesting. I said to myself, I'm finished after 3 books. And now the idea for more of an autobiographical piece, because a lot of people say, I really want to know the story, the good, bad, and the ugly of how one gets to this. And so I won't give you the title yet. I do know what it is, but I'm not going to say it yet because I haven't even gotten to the point of writing it yet. Okay. But there is a 4th book at some point, yes, which is going to be more my own journey.
I love that. Honestly, it's been amazing, TJ, to have you on as a guest. And again, thank you so much for providing such an incredible resource. I'm actually doing a video very shortly for social media talking about spiritual reads for the summer and for awakening. And you are literally a high recommendation, because I think it's such a beautiful and simple book to read. So thank you for providing that. Where can people find out more about you, connect with you?
TJWoodward.com. That's the best place. You can see all my social there and all my upcoming events.
I love that. Again, thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, to listening to our conversation, me and TJ Woodward. His book, Conscious Creating, is out now. I would definitely go download. It's a fantastic book. He also does amazing work with people in recovery and addiction. That's something else. If that affects you, please do go check it out. And to all of you, thank you for joining me. Thank you for spending your energy with me, and have a wonderful, peaceful, and present day.